It is a well-attested peculiarity of the British postal system that the more urgent the correspondence, the more likely it is to languish behind a hedge in Oxfordshire, or repose in a brass sorting tray beneath a sleeping porter. The letter in question, pale blue and faintly scented with violet water, bore a neat feminine hand and a postmark from Upper Quinton, but it did not arrive at Scotland Yard until precisely 24 hours after Mr. Mervyn Thistlethwaite, late of Pendlebury Hall, had been discovered sprawled with distinctly unaristocratic abandon at the foot of his own grand staircase, his skull split in a manner that suggested either the intervention of an exceedingly blunt fire-iron or an uncommonly vengeful ancestor. Lord Peter Death Breddon Wimsey, who was at that moment involved in the gentle but wholly absorbing task of cataloguing errors in a newly released translation of the Oresteia, received the news from Chief Inspector Parker over tea and seed cake at the Savile Club. Wimsey was stretched languidly in a corner armchair, looking rather like a raffish cherub in flannel, one long leg draped over the armrest, and a copy of the Times Literary Supplement balanced negligently upon his knee. "My dear Charles," said Wimsey, without looking up from a column excoriating the use of anastrophe in modern verse, "if you've come all the way from your lair in Queen Anne's Gate to discuss country house fatalities, I must insist on a second helping of seed cake. Otherwise, one feels quite under-equipped." Parker, who was used to this sort of thing, handed over a plain manila folder and said simply, "Mervyn Thistlethwaite, bludgeoned on Tuesday evening. Servants found him next morning. Local constabulary made an arrest. Fiancé's brother, ex-soldier. Argument overheard. Motive, money, drink, jealousy, some combination of the usual. But something's not sitting right." Wimsey yawned delicately, set aside the TLS and turned the file with one long finger. "The brother. Curious choice. They usually start with the butler, or the third cousin who reads too much Baudelaire." He flicked through the papers. "Pendlebury Hall. How excellently Gothic. Does it have a tower, a chapel, preferably in ruins?" "Both," said Parker grimly. "And a taxidermied boar in the main hall, according to the PC who reported it." Wimsey's eyes lit up. "Oh, my dear man, you should have led with that. Murder is a bore in Piccadilly. But give me a haunted hall, a disputed inheritance, and a hall stand full of hunting whips, and I'll give you a 5-act tragedy with footnotes." Parker poured himself some tea. "There's one more thing," he said, fishing in his coat. "This arrived by post at the Yard this morning. No return address. Posted yesterday morning in Quintern. Addressed to you." Wimsey took the envelope with sudden interest. He slit it with a nail file, unfolded the single sheet, and read in silence. His eyebrows performed an intricate ballet of surprise, amusement, and, at last, something more thoughtful. He read it again, then set it down on the tea tray beside the cream jug, and regarded Parker solemnly. "Well, it says," said Wimsey slowly, "you're looking in the wrong place. He was not pushed down the stairs. He was summoned." Parker blinked. "Summoned?" "Yes," said Wimsey, leaning back, eyes half closed. "As in called Charles. Invited, perhaps. Possibly even lured. Which rather puts a damper on the bludgeoning theory, unless we are now imagining homicidal seances. And look here. Note the postmark." Parker leaned in. "Quintern, the local village?" Wimsey steepled his fingers. "Posted yesterday morning, the morning after the murder, which is inconvenient, given that young Mr. Albury was already in custody by then." "So," said Parker slowly, "either we have a very clever hoaxer, or," said Wimsey with relish, "someone knows what the devil actually happened, and is feeling inconveniently guilty, or charmingly superior. Either way, Charles, I do believe we shall have to motor down to Pendlebury Hall. Bring the barber, coat, and a flask. I sense bogs and sinister housekeepers in our immediate future." And with that, Lord Peter rose, rang for his hat and gloves, and quoted, with a glint in his eye, "What rough beast its hour come round at last, slouches towards Quintern to be caught?" He paused. "Besides," he added as they made for the door, "I've always wanted to see a man get summoned to his death. It's so much more stylish than a simple whack with the poker." The village of Upper Quinton presented itself upon first approach as the sort of place where nothing more untoward than a fallen teacup might disturb the hush of the hedgerows. It was mid-morning by the time Lord Peter and Parker arrived, the sun diluted through a fine mist that clung to the flanks of the hills and painted the flint cottages in muted greys. A single shop, a war memorial of pensive stone figures, and a pub with a sign so faded that its painted boar seemed to be slinking off the wood from sheer embarrassment. This was the extent of Quintern's civic pride. Atop the slight rise beyond the churchyard stood Pendlebury Hall, its windows shuttered like a sullen child, and its ivy throttling the south wall with botanical determination. Whimsy, who had insisted on driving himself in his two-seater Daimler despite Parker's dire warnings about mud and mechanical sympathy, now stood at the edge of the gravel, hands in pockets, contemplating the facade. "Observe, Charles," he said, "how the architecture lurches from Elizabethan to late Victorian in the manner of a family trying to forget something. A wing added, a tower removed. One imagines generations of Thistlethwaite's trying to reinvent themselves with every new inheritance and scandal." Parker, squinting up at the mossy stone and gables with his usual law enforcement sobriety, said only, "And yet they couldn't build a banister that keeps its occupants from toppling head first." They were admitted by a parlor maid who possessed the glacial dignity of one who considers all visitors potential disturbances to the linen schedule. She led them to the morning room, a chamber upholstered in faded yellow and guarded by a pair of Chinese dogs, who looked as though they'd once belonged to a considerably grander house and were offended by the downgrade. Lady Isabel Thistlethwaite greeted them with a show of constraint that suggested she had nearly fainted with gratitude when the police made their arrest, and now wished desperately that no one would reopen the matter. She was a tall woman in her early 60s, hair tightly pinned, her grey silk blouse as crisp as her expression. "My lord," she said, with a nod that fell just short of gracious. "Chief Inspector, I'm not sure how I can be of use now that the culprit has, well, been apprehended." Whimsy bowed with exaggerated charm. "Dear Lady Isabel, I fear the British Postal Service disagrees with you. It sent us something positively fascinating." He produced the letter and watched her carefully. Her mouth tightened slightly, but she neither recoiled nor attempted to read it. "I see," she said at last. "Some prankster. There are always local eccentrics. You cannot imagine the sort of nonsense that ends up on our doorstep. Spiritualists, animal rights petitioners, women demanding we return their ancestors' hedgerow. My late husband tolerated such things. I do not." Whimsy inclined his head gravely. "Spiritualists, you say? Curious. Was Mr. Thistlethwaite of an occult persuasion?" "He was of a bored persuasion," she snapped. "He collected ideas the way a child collects beetles. As soon as they stopped wriggling, he lost interest." "And what precisely had ceased to wriggle when he died?" Lady Isabel blinked. "Pardon me." Whimsy smiled. "A crude metaphor, but I suspect you take my meaning. Was there any particular notion, person, or experiment that had lately ceased to entertain him?" There was a pause. Her gaze flicked briefly to Parker, as if considering whether she might dismiss the question on grounds of taste. Then she exhaled. He had taken an interest in the villagers. Of late, particularly a young woman, not a servant. Well, she gave readings, I believe. Tarot. Ridiculous, of course. "Name?" said Parker crisply. "Miss Ferris, the vicar's niece. Or cousin. She's not been here long. Mervyn liked to patronize people. He thought it charitable. One might say, overfamiliar." Whimsy filed that with a slight nod. Had they quarrelled? Not exactly. But he had moods. And fancies. Lately he was edgy. Drinking more, I suppose. His sister noticed it. Clarissa. Ah, yes, said Whimsy. Miss Clarissa Thistlethwaite. The same Clarissa who was betrothed to Mr. Albury, our man in custody. The air shifted perceptibly. She is. I don't know what she thinks now. It's all been very trying. Whimsy was not looking at her now, but at the edge of the fireplace, where a faint scuff on the tiles suggested something heavy had been dragged or dropped recently. He made no remark, but turned back with bright cordiality. If we may, Lady Isabel, I'd like to speak with the household. Servants, that sort of thing. Nothing terribly intrusive. Just one or two impressions to satisfy ourselves that this anonymous correspondent wasn't indulging in malicious fantasy. We wouldn't want to embarrass the constabulary without good cause. Lady Isabel rose. You'll find most of them below stairs. Ask for Mrs. Rake, the housekeeper. The name gave Whimsy undisguised pleasure. Splendid. What a marvelous name. One always hopes for a Mrs. Rake in these cases. So much more promising than a Mrs. Simmons or a Miss Todd. Come, Charles, we descend. The servants' quarters were a low-ceilinged warren beneath the eastern wing, painted a pale blue that had long since surrendered to a mottled grey. Mrs. Rake, a woman of indeterminate age and the sort of voice that could suppress a rebellion in full cry, offered tea with the air of granting a papal indulgence. I was in the laundry when it happened, she told them briskly, not 10 feet from the back stairs, which come up to the hall. I heard nothing. Not a shout, not a fall. But surely, said Whimsy, accepting a teacup, if the master had taken a tumble from the top landing, there would have been some commotion. A crash? A shout? She shrugged. It's a stone stair, sir. And he always went up with his wireless on. One of those new portables. Played it on the landings. Said it helped him think. Whimsy looked intrigued. Really? What sort of music? News, mostly. Or those plays with all the voices. Fascinating, said Whimsy, stirring sugar absently. And who was the last to see him alive? Would have been Jennings, his valet. Took him his whiskey and a volume of Goethe around 8:30. Whimsy looked up. German? He was in a mood for the melancholy. Jennings said he was reading it aloud. German was one of his lordship's, fancies. They interviewed Jennings next, a pinched man with hollow cheeks and an eagerness to be helpful that bordered on despair. He was in his study when I left him, my lord, sitting quite upright. I could hear him speaking to himself. Foreign words. Gave me a turn, if I may say. Like he were reciting an incantation. Parker interjected. No visitors that evening? No deliveries? No, sir. Not unless someone came through the garden gate. That bolt's always off. We keep asking Mrs. Rake to see to it. Whimsy's gaze sharpened. Garden gate? Off the side terrace, sir. Leads out through the hedge to the back lane. Folk use it for bringing in parcels. Post, too. Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. And does the hedge give a view of the stairwell windows? Yes, sir. Clear as anything when the curtains are open. They left the servants' floor in a thoughtful silence. Outside, the fog had lifted a little, revealing a distant line of hedgerow and the broken outline of a greenhouse. Parker glanced sideways. Well, Whimsy smiled. What do you make of a man who quotes Goethe, listens to the wireless, and sits in solitude reciting German at the hour of his death? I think he was a pretentious fool, said Parker. Ah, said Whimsy. But you see, Charles, that's what makes it so interesting. And with that, he turned down the garden path toward the hedge and the broken gate. Lord Peter paused by the garden gate. A disheveled wooden affair hung crooked on rusted hinges. It listed gently in the breeze, tapping once against the stone post with the despondent rhythm of something forgotten. The hedge, though slightly overgrown, parted just enough to reveal a narrow lane beyond, rutted and damp, and a small rise in the landscape where, with the curtains drawn back, one might indeed gain a perfect view of the landing window on the upper floor of Pendlebury Hall. He knelt to inspect the latch. The bolt was, as promised, slack in its housing. Moss had begun to colonize the lower wood, and the earth bore no obvious footprint, but Whimsy's fingers paused at a scratch on the lower panel, just below the latch. A fresh mark, barely more than a shaving, but clean, recent, and diagonal. He murmured. "Charles, did I ever tell you about the unfortunate Bishop of Ringwood and the incident with the hedge pruners?" "I believe you did," said Parker dryly. "And I didn't believe a word of it then either." Whimsy straightened, brushing his trousers. "No matter, but observe. If one wished to deliver a letter anonymously and one were too nervous or too guilty to post it through the front door, what better approach than through this very gate?" Parker eyed the path. "You think the letter writer came here, not the post box?" "I think," said Whimsy, "that the letter was composed with an intention of secrecy, and secrets are better preserved by hand than by stamp. Whether it was ultimately posted or not remains to be determined. But let us suppose, for the moment, that this gate saw more use than the housekeeper cares to admit." They returned inside just as the afternoon gloom began to thicken. Mrs. Rake, when pressed, admitted under protest that young Miss Ferris had once come round to leave a note for Mr. Thistlethwaite, though she couldn't say when, and insisted it had been perfectly decent and nothing in it. The young lady had one of those odd calm ways, like she's always looking past you. Whimsy requested her address, which Mrs. Rake provided with pursed lips and a tone that made it clear she considered clairvoyants little better than card sharps. The vicarage stood about half a mile down the road, neat and red-bricked, with a clutch of roses attempting an ambitious climb up the front trellis. Miss Ferris answered the door herself. She was not, as Whimsy had half feared, dressed in scarves and bangles. Instead, she wore a severe navy skirt and a cream blouse, and looked more like a school teacher than a mystic. Her eyes, however, were unsettling. Pale, wide-set, and very still, they gave the disquieting impression that she had already weighed the contents of one's soul and found it rather ordinary. "You are Lord Peter Whimsy," she said without preamble, "and you're investigating the death of Mr. Thistlethwaite." "I do try to be discreet," said Whimsy cheerfully, "but it's deuced difficult when one's so terribly recognizable." She smiled faintly. "May I offer you tea?" Inside, the sitting room was sparse but oddly balanced. Books, a few framed landscapes, a kettle gently simmering on the hob. There was no clutter, no scent of incense, no trace of the theatre Whimsy had half expected. Parker took up a seat in the corner with his notebook while Whimsy accepted a cup and leaned back. "I understand," he said lightly, "that you knew the late Mr. Thistlethwaite." "I did," said Miss Ferris. "He was curious, desperately so, about things people aren't usually allowed to be curious about in houses like Pendlebury. Such as death, the possibility of life beyond it, what lies behind intention, whether we choose or whether we are compelled." Whimsy cocked his head. "And did he find an answer?" "He found fear," she said. "Most people do." "And did you discuss such matters often?" "Not often. He came here 3 times. Once with skepticism, once with interest, once with urgency." "When? The last time?" 4 days before his death." "Did he say what troubled him?" She hesitated. "He had received a letter, an unsigned note. It frightened him." Parker straightened. "What did it say?" She looked away. "Only that he had been seen." "Doing what?" I asked. He didn't say. He only muttered something about the past, never staying buried. He seemed cornered." "Did you encourage him to act on it?" "No. I told him to sleep, to stop drinking, and to speak to someone who loved him. He said that was the problem. He wasn't sure who that was anymore." Whimsy rose and wandered to the fireplace, where a row of books stood upright between 2 grey stones. His finger drifted along the titles. Eckhart, Boehm, William James. "Miss Ferris, may I ask, did you write the letter we received?" She met his gaze without blinking. No. Do you know who did? No, but I imagine you'll find them quite soon. Because they're careless? Because they're suffering, she said simply. Whimsy paused a moment, then smiled and bowed slightly. I thank you for your time and your tea. Outside, as they returned to the car, Parker exhaled sharply. Do you believe her? I believe she's frightened, said Whimsy, and frightened people tell the truth sideways. The light was draining from the sky as they motored back toward the hall. The trees loomed in silhouette, the branches like clawed hands scraping at the last threads of day. Whimsy was silent for some time, then said abruptly, Charles, how fast do you think one can walk from the garden gate to the lane's end? In the dark? Parker thought. 10 minutes at a steady pace. Longer if you're hiding. Precisely. And if one were summoned, as our mysterious correspondent claims, where would one go first? The study, the landing, wherever they'd been told to meet. But summoned by what? Murmured Whimsy. Not a voice. Not an order. A sound, perhaps. Or a message. A signal. He turned the car sharply back into the Pendlebury Drive, where the lamps in the main hall had just been lit. The house glowed dimly, like a sullen lantern in the fog. Jennings met them at the door, looking more pinched than before. Telegram, my lord. Just arrived. For you. Whimsy opened it slowly, his brow arched. Well, well, he said. It seems our young man in custody has attempted something melodramatic with a bootlace. Parker swore softly. But the note he left behind, Whimsy continued, eyes scanning the liners, is considerably more interesting. He handed it to Parker. The handwriting was scrawled and shaky, but legible. I didn't kill him, but I saw who did. I was on the landing. He was talking to someone. I didn't recognize the voice. I only stayed because I was ashamed. Tell Clarissa. I wanted to tell her. But it was too late. I was already down the stairs when he fell. Parker looked up. So he was there. But he didn't do it. No, said Whimsy softly, and someone knew he was there, and counted on his silence. He turned slowly, gazing back up the great stair, now lit in dull gold. Charles, he murmured, do you recall what Mrs. Rake said about the wireless? That he listened to it, often. Yes, and what sort of programs? Plays. Dialogue. Precisely, said Whimsy. So imagine, for a moment, a man in his study, half tight, reciting foreign verse, listening to voices on the air, and someone opens the garden gate and calls him not by voice, but by sound. Parker frowned. Are you saying it wasn't a person he heard, but a recording? Whimsy smiled. Not saying, merely suggesting. And then, more quietly, someone summoned him to the stairs with something he trusted, something he thought he recognized, and it led him precisely where they wanted him to go. They stood in silence a moment, staring at the stair's dark curve, the carpet slightly worn on the fourth step. Whimsy tapped the banister with one knuckle. Tomorrow, he said, we speak to Miss Clarissa. The drawing room had not changed since the day of the death. Not in essence, at least. Perhaps the angle of the sun was a little different now, catching the brass edge of the fireplace grate, or the scent of the lilies in the far window had begun to turn ever so faintly metallic. But the heavy velvet drapes remained drawn halfway across the tall windows, and the armchair facing the hearth, the late Mr. Thistlewaite's favored seat, still bore the slight depression where he had sat, slumped and glass in hand, mere hours before the fatal fall. Clarissa Thistlewaite had aged since Tuesday. It was not in the face, which remained composed and symmetrical, but in the slight slowness of her voice. A pause too long before certain answers, a weariness about the eyes that no powder could touch. She sat straight, her gloved hands clasped lightly in her lap, and regarded Lord Peter Wimsey with the air of someone accustomed to being admired and quietly prepared to endure interrogation with dignity. "I understand," she said, "that Arthur attempted something dramatic in his cell." Wimsey inclined his head. "A regrettable business. Fortunately, he was discovered in time. One of those moments where the ineptitude of the rope may yet be counted as providence." "He's always had a taste for tragedy," she said. "It's inherited. Our mother used to read Racine to us at bedtime." Wimsey smiled faintly. "That explains much." She looked toward the fireplace. "I presume he wrote something." "He did." "Is it helpful?" "It confirms that he saw your husband, heard him at least before the fall, and that he wasn't alone." Clarissa did not react at once. She reached very precisely for a crystal tumbler of water and took a sip. "My husband often had visitors late," she said. "He suffered from restlessness. He talked sometimes to his records." To his records. Parker, seated to one side, blinked. Clarissa gestured vaguely. His old gramophone discs, snatches of dialogue, readings. He had one of Gielgud doing Richard II and another of Coleridge's Ancient Mariner. I once found him reciting half a soliloquy to an empty room. He said the air was more honest than people. Wimsey's eyes sparkled. "A romantic, then?" "No, a coward." Parker coughed politely. "Did he ever record his own voice?" "I wouldn't know, but I doubt it. He hated the sound of it. Said it reminded him of his father, whom he also disliked, whom he feared." She paused, "and occasionally emulated. My husband was a man who oscillated violently between imitation and rebellion." "A fascinating combination," murmured Wimsey. "Tell me, on the night in question, where were you between 9 and 10? Clarissa looked at him directly. "In my bedroom, writing letters." "To whom?" "My aunt in Dorset. And to the Isis, editor of a local paper who'd asked me for a subscription to a literary society I support." "May we see them?" She hesitated, then rose. "If they haven't yet gone out with the post." She left the room, her steps quiet but sure. When the door shut, Parker leaned in. "You think she's lying?" Wimsey shook his head. "I think she's managing. The question is, what?" Clarissa returned moments later with 2 pale blue envelopes unsealed. Wimsey took them delicately, inspecting the handwriting. The same across both, he noted, and timed about right. He sniffed one. Still damp. Written, perhaps, just before the arrival of certain inconvenient guests. Clarissa said nothing. "Madam," Wimsey said, "did your husband ever mention a quarrel with Arthur?" "A quarrel?" She smiled coolly. "My husband could quarrel with the furniture." "True, but I gather the boy had cause. There was a talk of debts." "And Arthur's idea of justice is infantile. He disliked being corrected, and Lionel never knew when to stop." Wimsey folded the letters neatly. "Tell me, did your husband ever record anything himself?" She blinked. "As I said, I don't believe so, but wait." She moved to the cabinet near the writing desk and drew out a slim, black lacquered case. "This," she said, "was given to him last Christmas. A portable dictaphone. He was meant to use it for memos, committee reports, drafts of speeches. May I?" She nodded. Wimsey opened the case. Inside, nestled in green felt, lay a small cylindrical recorder, the kind fashionable among minor civil servants. The spool had not been rewound. He pressed play. A crackle. Then the hiss of silence. Then faintly a voice. Low, slightly slurred. "There are no ghosts. Only echoes. Repetition until it kills you." Pause. Then. "She says she doesn't mind, but her eyes say otherwise. Glass eyes, the kind you find in taxidermy." Then silence again. Wimsey let it run a little longer, but no further sound emerged. "Would you mind if I took this with me?" he asked. Clarissa gave a weary wave of assent. Outside, the fog had begun to settle again, clinging to the hedges like wet gauze. Whimsy handed the case to Parker as they reached the car. "Take it to the yard. Have the rest extracted. There's more on there. We just need the right tools." Parker nodded. "What are you expecting?" "A confession, perhaps, or a rehearsal." He tapped the bonnet of the motor absently. "We've been thinking in terms of sudden violence. But what if the murder was deliberate only in its design, not its execution? What if the killer merely arranged things, knowing Thistlethwaite's weaknesses, his drinking, his habit of wandering to the landing, his love of recorded voices? You're saying he was led to fall? Not pushed, drawn. And Arthur was there, but too ashamed to speak. He saw someone else, or heard them, and now he's tried to end it." Parker looked grim. "Then who arranged it?" Whimsy's mouth twitched. "That, my dear Charles, is what the tape shall tell us. Unless, of course, it's been cleverly edited." They drove on in silence for a while. At the village post office, Whimsy insisted on stopping. The postmistress, a small, angular woman with an aggrieved expression, emerged from behind the counter with reluctance. "Yes, Lord Whimsy?" "Good afternoon. I wonder, did any letters go out the morning after the death at Pendlebury Hall? Specifically anything from Miss Clarissa?" The postmistress sniffed. "None that I saw. She usually sends old Gibbons round, but he didn't come that morning." "Gibbons?" "The manservant. Bit slow but harmless." "Thank you." Back in the car, Whimsy sighed. She lied. The letters weren't posted. Maybe just forgot? Maybe. Or maybe she didn't intend them to be posted at all. Maybe they were written to cover time, just in case someone asked. "And Gibbons. We speak to him. At once." Pendlebury Hall's kitchen was dim, lit only by a green-shaded lamp above the pantry. Gibbons sat at the long, scrubbed table, peeling apples with excessive focus. He looked up as Whimsy entered and blinked rapidly. "Gibbons," said Whimsy gently, "you didn't go to the post office Wednesday morning." The man shifted. "No, sir." "Why not?" "Didn't feel right, sir." "Why?" Gibbons paused, eyes darting. Because I knew there'd be police. I didn't want to be away if they needed anything. That's all?" Whimsy smiled kindly. "That's very commendable. But I wonder, do you recall hearing anything odd that night? Anything recorded?" Gibbons blinked. "Like the old music box, sir." "Music box?" "Yes, sir. Upstairs, in the study. Sometimes he played it when he was drunk." Whimsy stilled. "Can I see it?" Gibbons hesitated, then nodded. In the study, the music box sat on a narrow shelf behind the decanter tray, black lacquer with mother-of-pearl lilies. Whimsy opened it. Inside, the cylinder glinted, half-wound. A thin metal comb waited. He turned the key and let it play. The melody was high, tinkling and oddly distorted. But in the middle came a strange interruption, a sudden click, then, unmistakably, a voice. Not in song, not in tune, but a phrase. "Come up, I've something for you." Whimsy shut the box abruptly. He looked at Parker. "It wasn't just any voice," he said. Parker frowned. "Then whose?" Whimsy's expression darkened. "I believe, Charles," he said slowly, "we shall need to revisit Miss Ferris." It was some hours past the civilized luncheon hour when Lord Peter Whimsy and Inspector Parker arrived once again at the Ferris cottage, a charming affair half obscured by drooping wisteria and the uneven shadow of an overgrown laurel hedge. A woman might find such a place poetic. Policemen might call it evasive. Lord Peter, for his part, had once described it as exactly the sort of house where one leaves a window open for the night air and wakes to find a bishop murdered in the boot room. Miss Sylvia Ferris answered the door herself. She was not, to Whimsy's trained eye, surprised. "I thought you might come," she said, standing aside. That must be either a remarkable intuition or a guilty conscience, said Whimsy lightly, stepping into the modest drawing-room. We are hoping it is the former, for everyone's convenience. I suppose you found something, she said, gesturing vaguely at the 2 chairs by the hearth, though she did not sit herself. Another thread to pull. Whimsy removed his gloves. I do adore a good thread, Miss Ferris, especially when one end is neatly tucked into a black lacquer music box. That made her flinch, almost imperceptibly. He went on gently. Did you know, my dear young lady, that a wax cylinder, when tampered with, can retain fragments of recorded sound? If, say, a voice was recorded and then hastily played over by a different melody, some artifacts often remain. One might even, with the right equipment, separate the layers. Sylvia moved toward the mantel, touching the porcelain figurine there without seeming to notice it. You think I made a recording? She said coolly. Of what? Music? Of a summons, a beckoning. Come up, I've something for you. That was the phrase, I believe. She turned to face him now, her arms folded. And you think Lionel heard that and... What? Rose from his armchair like a mesmerized pigeon and threw himself over the banisters? Whimsy's eyes sparkled. No, indeed. But I think he did rise. He did come up. And what awaited him? Well, that's the matter in question. You've no evidence of that. No direct evidence yet, but a rather compelling cascade of details. Let us imagine for a moment that you, possessing both a lovely voice and a keen sense of theatricality, had made such a recording. Let us further imagine that it was carefully planted in the music box that Lionel liked to play when he drank. Timed just right, wound just enough so that it would begin its message once the melody lulled him into his stupor. You're suggesting hypnotism. Nothing so dramatic. Just misdirection, a familiar tune, a familiar voice. Just a suggestion, no more. Enough to cause him to ascend the stairs, and perhaps, with a little help, metaphorically or otherwise, enough to make him lose his balance. Sylvia said nothing for a long moment. Then quietly, I wasn't even at the house that night. You were not seen at the house. That is a different matter. I was at the vicarage. Were you, though? Or was that where you said you were? I told Inspector Grimsby everything. He confirmed my alibi. Ask the vicar's wife. I have. She recalls you, arriving at 10:30, just in time for the end of the musical evening, but your whereabouts earlier remain. Elastic. Sylvia's color rose. You can't just invent timelines to suit your theory. But I don't. I test them, and your presence is echoed in a way quite independent of human memory. You see, there was a partial footprint, faint but quite unmistakable, in the dust of the west corridor upstairs. The kind of shoe you wear, I dare say, for rehearsals. Rather thin-soled, rather pointed, and very few visitors go up that way. Sylvia crossed the room slowly and sat, her hands gripping the arms of the chair. You think I engineered this? I think you understood the theatre of it all, and I think you despised Lionel Thistlethwaite in a very quiet, enduring way. Shall we say, artistically? She gave a bitter smile. He was a monster, not in the obvious hand-wringing way, but in slow doses. He could unmake a person with praise. He liked to rehearse people, arrange their lines, prompt their entrances, even Clarissa, especially Clarissa. Parker spoke for the first time. Did he ever threaten you? Not directly. But he said once, if I can't have your voice, I'll bury it. I knew what he meant. He could ruin me. He had influence. And Arthur? I think he loathed him too. But Arthur was too much like him. Soft around the edges, desperate for approval. He tried to copy Lionel's mannerisms once. Lionel laughed until Arthur cried. Whimsy leaned forward. Then why not come forward when Arthur was arrested? Her jaw tightened. Because I couldn't prove anything, and I was there, just for a moment. I left the music box in the study on the pretext of returning a book. It was enough. To get him upstairs? Yes. And I think he must have tripped. I never meant it to go so far. I only wanted humiliation. Something public. Something he couldn't control. And instead he died. Yes. Whimsy stood slowly. That, Miss Ferris, is not quite the end of the tale. Because someone moved the music box. Someone rewound it. And someone tried to erase the recording. She looked up at him sharply. I didn't. No, I don't think you did. Silence deepened in the little room, disturbed only by the ticking of a clock that had not kept accurate time in years. Parker rose. Then who? Whimsy looked down at Sylvia with a strange softness. I believe the final curtain, he said, has yet to fall, but we are close. And if you truly meant no harm, then you'd best tell Clarissa the truth before someone else does. Or she'll have no choice but to finish what she started. Clarissa? Sylvia said, startled. Why would she? But Whimsy had already turned to go. Outside, the air was growing damp again, the horizon stained with the coppery promise of another sullen dusk. She lied about the letters, said Parker as they reached the car. She lied about the recording, and she's the only one with access to the dictaphone and the music box. She didn't lie to protect Sylvia, Whimsy replied. She lied to control the story, the tidy ending, the literary flourish. You mean she knew Sylvia had set the recording? Worse, I think she knew Lionel would follow the voice, and she made sure the stairs were just a little more treacherous than usual. A spot of furniture polish on the upper step, perhaps, or a loosened balustrade. Parker was silent a moment. You mean it was collusion? Whimsy shook his head. No, it was editing. Miss Ferris wrote the prologue. Clarissa wrote the final act. And the tape? If my hunch is correct, said Whimsy, eyes gleaming, we'll find a voice buried beneath the melody. But not Sylvia's. Then whose? Whimsy smiled. Clarissa's. Calm, coaxing, theatrical. The sort of voice that tells you it's perfectly safe to come upstairs. Parker did not speak again until they were nearly back at the Thistlethwaite house. The gravel made a sharp scrunch under the tires as the car nosed into its usual position near the clipped yew hedge. And still he sat with his gloved hands resting on his knees, as though reluctant to move lest the fragile speculation between them should collapse under motion. You're sure about the voice? He asked at last, not quite looking at Whimsy. No, said Whimsy cheerfully, stepping out into the cool afternoon air. But I have an enthusiasm for being contradicted by gramophone evidence. It adds a mechanical elegance to things. Clarissa was in the parlor when they returned, bent over a set of corrected proofs, with her hair pinned in a kind of meticulous negligence, as though she wished the world to believe she had dashed in from some wind-swept garden and not, in fact, spent the morning fussing with comma splices. She looked up, and her expression was poised perfectly between polite attention and weariness, the mask of a woman long practiced in the art of fending off inconvenient inquiries. I thought you'd both gone, she said, as Whimsy entered and gave a bow so small and theatrical it might have been mistaken for a stage direction. Oh, merely circulating, he said. You know how it is. One must stretch one's logic like a good pair of gloves before the fit is snug enough for a murder. I assume this is not a social visit, she said, although you do have the air of a man who's just attended a private performance of something unexpected. I've always said amateur theatricals have much to recommend them, said Whimsy, taking a seat opposite her. The motivations are clearer than in Shakespeare, and the poison is generally real. She glanced at Parker, who remained standing. Is this the part where I'm arrested for bad writing? I should hardly think that's a criminal offense, said Whimsy. If it were, I'd dare. Say most of Fleet Street would be behind bars, but I do have a small inquiry. It concerns the music box, or rather, the voice embedded within it. Clarissa's pen, which had been hovering just above the margin of a paragraph, dipped and left a blot. Voice? Yes, said Whimsy, the rather alluring female voice that comes faintly through if one listens closely enough, underneath the lullaby. One might not notice it, unless one was inclined to question why Lionel should have gone upstairs that night when he had no habit of doing so at that hour. Certainly not in that condition. Clarissa set the pen down with an audible click. "You're saying someone tampered with it?" "Oh, quite. Not merely tampered, but composed. There was a recorded message, a summons, and the voice, well, it was curiously specific, warm, persuasive." "I see," she said quietly. "And you think it was Sylvia?" Whimsy blinked. "Do I? Well," she said, rising now. "You've spent the morning with her, haven't you? I imagine she's said all sorts of things." "Oh, she has," said Whimsy, watching her carefully, "including the fact that she left the music box in the study." Clarissa's expression did not change, but the muscles of her throat tensed slightly. She claimed she only meant to embarrass Lionel, that she believed the message would be absurd enough to fluster him, make him look a fool. She swears she didn't expect anything more serious. Clarissa walked to the window and looked out. "And you believe her?" "I believe," said Whimsy gently, "that she did not know she was being directed in turn, that there was a second hand on the stage ropes, someone who understood how to tighten the scene. And I suppose you think that was me." "Not think," said Whimsy. "Merely observe. Sylvia was clever, but not precise. She would not have rewound the cylinder after use. She wouldn't have removed it either. Someone did, after the fall, someone who knew how much was too much." Clarissa turned back to him. "If I had wanted Lionel dead, I assure you I could have done it without theatrical devices. A decanter left uncorked, a missed dosage, no need for melodrama." "But the melodrama suited you," said Whimsy. "You wanted it to mean something poetic, a fall after hubris, like a Greek play. Only you underestimated how inconvenient reality can be. Bodies break the wrong way, the wrong people confess, and the wrong questions get asked." Clarissa did not reply. She sat once more, very still. Parker stepped forward. "We can check the wax. There are methods." "I know," she said. "Clarissa," said Whimsy almost gently, "why did you lie about the letter?" At that, she smiled faintly. "Because I knew it would undo the shape of things. The letter arrived too late. That was perfect. The great man ruined by timing. To learn it had come before, while he was still alive, would make it petty. Just a squabble." "But it was just a squabble," said Parker. "He thought Arthur would be humiliated, and he wanted to say so." "Yes, but only I knew that, and if I destroyed the letter or delayed it, I could control the narrative. A literary death." Whimsy regarded her for a long time. "Clarissa," he said, "did you loosen the stair rail?" "No," she said simply. "But you knew it was loose." Her eyes flickered. "He had fallen before, months ago. I told the housekeeper to report it. She said she had, but I don't think she ever did." "So you left it," said Parker. "I left it," she repeated. "He'd refused to have it repaired himself. Said it made the house feel old-fashioned, like a place that still had secrets. Well, it had one more secret left in it, didn't it?" Whimsy rose and walked toward the mantel, where a small black and white photograph of Lionel Thistlethwaite stood in a silver frame. In it, he was young and laughing, a script in hand, a woman's arm, probably Clarissa's, just visible at the edge. "I do not think Sylvia meant him to die," said Whimsy quietly. "But I think you knew he might. You said nothing, did nothing. You edited the ending to fit your story." She said nothing for a long time. Then, in a voice almost without breath, "I couldn't save him and keep the story, and the story was the only thing of mine he hadn't taken." Outside, the wind rattled the window latch softly, like a polite knock at the edge of conscience. Parker made a small sound in his throat and turned to Whimsy. "Shall I?" But Whimsy shook his head. "Not yet," he said. "There's one more piece that doesn't fit, and I should like to hear from Arthur again." I think he knows more than he said. And besides, he glanced back at Clarissa. I do so hate to interrupt a climax before the final cue. The next morning broke grey and perfunctory, as though the weather itself had grown disillusioned with the drama of the house on the hill. Whimsy rose early, took his breakfast in the conservatory with a copy of the Times, and hummed a bar from the Yeoman of the Guard while buttering toast with the elegance of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. Parker joined him 20 minutes later, slightly harassed from having had to pacify the local constabulary, who had taken a dim view of being told to hold off on an arrest now that everything appeared, at least to their minds, solved. "Do you ever find," said Whimsy, peering into his coffee, "that the end of a case comes too early?" "Too early for what?" asked Parker, sitting down with a sigh. "For truth," said Whimsy lightly. "The sort of truth that seeps rather than explodes. Clarissa gave us a play. I prefer a postscript." Parker rubbed his eyes. She admitted to concealing the letter and allowing the stare to remain dangerous. She all but admitted to orchestrating the conditions of Lionel's death. "What more do you want?" "I want to know who knew about the music box," said Whimsy. "Clarissa claims it was Sylvia's idea, but how did Sylvia learn the mechanism could hold a recording? Lionel's habits were anything but public, and the machine was in his private study." "She could have seen it during a visit," said Parker. "He wasn't exactly discreet." "No," said Whimsy, "but he was careful with his toys. The wax cylinders, the tuning, the man was obsessive. Sylvia might have guessed it played something, but to time it, to plant a voice that would trigger a specific response? No. Someone else coached her, or gave her the recording." Parker frowned. "And you think Arthur?" "I think Arthur," said Whimsy, "has been very quiet for a man whose professional ruin began with a single unsigned letter. Shall we prod him?" Arthur Thistlewaite occupied a modest cottage on the far edge of the estate, a place Whimsy observed had been once intended for a gardener or secretary, and had the air of something only tolerated out of inherited guilt. The man himself answered the door in shirt sleeves with a startled look that turned quickly into polite resentment. "I thought we'd gone over everything," he said as he let them in. Whimsy smiled, examining the contents of the sitting room with idle amusement. It was densely packed with books, mostly theatrical memoirs and reference works, along with a gramophone of more modest vintage than the one in Lionel's study. "We're not here to accuse," said Whimsy. "Only to reflect. That letter, for instance. You're quite certain Lionel never mentioned it directly?" Arthur hesitated. "He didn't need to. I saw it on his desk. I recognized the handwriting. It was Clarissa's." "Curious," said Whimsy. "She claims she delayed posting it." "She must be lying then." "Indeed," said Whimsy. "But why should she lie about sending a letter that you yourself say you saw on Lionel's desk? Unless—" He turned, suddenly alert. "You saw the letter, but did you read it?" Arthur's jaw tightened. "No." "Then how did you know it was about you?" There was a long pause. "Because I knew he'd do it," said Arthur. "He was angry with me. Furious. He thought I'd embarrassed him on set, that I'd made a fool of him in front of crew, but I hadn't. I'd merely refused to reshoot a scene that made no sense. I said so, plainly, and I knew he'd take revenge. So when I saw Clarissa's handwriting, well, I assumed she'd written to back him." Whimsy nodded slowly. "So you didn't read the letter, but you took it, didn't you?" Arthur stared at him, lips slightly parted. "No." Wait, are you suggesting I stole it?" "Clarissa says the letter never arrived until after Lionel's death, but Lionel's secretary claims to have seen him open it, 2 days before the accident. And you say you saw it on the desk. The only logical conclusion is that it was removed after his death." Arthur folded his arms. "Then she took it. She had access." "Did she?" Whimsy's tone sharpened. "Clarissa hadn't entered the study in weeks. She and Lionel were avoiding each other. But you came to the house. You had tea with him 3 days before the fall, and you asked to borrow his copy of the Agamemnon, which was in that very room." There was a tremor now, just a flicker, in Arthur's left eyelid. Parker caught it too. Whimsy continued softly, "You took the letter, Arthur, because it wasn't what you expected. It wasn't about your argument at all. It was about Sylvia." "I didn't," Arthur began, then stopped. "You don't understand." "Help me then," said Whimsy without rancor. Arthur sat heavily. "The letter said she had come to him. Sylvia. She said she was pregnant. Lionel thought it was a lie, a trap. He wrote to Clarissa asking her to intervene. He said it was Clarissa's duty to keep the family from scandal." Whimsy said nothing. Arthur went on. "He said I was unfit. He'd seen my drinking, my debts. He said he'd have me cut out of everything, that she was lying to elevate herself, and that I was too weak to see it." "So you took the letter," said Whimsy, "because you didn't want Clarissa to see it. Not because it condemned you, but because it condemned Sylvia." Arthur nodded. "She didn't deserve that. I loved her." Whimsy gave a small sigh. "And did you know she was planning the music box scheme?" Arthur's eyes darted. She said she wanted to scare him, that he'd wronged her. She didn't tell me how. But you helped. I told her the study's layout, the timing of Lionel's habits. I never expected it would, but it did," said Whimsy quietly. "And then you panicked. You realized the stair was faulty, that Lionel was dead, and that the message Sylvia used might point back to you. So you tried to cover your tracks. You took the letter, perhaps even removed the wax cylinder." Arthur looked ill. "I didn't mean to kill him," he said. "No," said Whimsy, rising. "But between you and Clarissa, you created the conditions. 2 people seeking control, 1 narrative too many." Parker cleared his throat. "What now?" Whimsy looked down at Arthur, who seemed already spent, a man unraveled, not by guilt, but by its theatricality. "I'll need that cylinder, if you still have it," said Whimsy. "And then I think Clarissa deserves to hear the unabridged version of her own tragedy." He straightened his tie. "After all, the curtain hasn't quite fallen yet." It was not until after luncheon that Lord Peter Whimsy requested the housekeeper to permit him the use of the small parlour that had once served as Lady Osbert's embroidery room and had since taken on the melancholy dignity of an ancestral oubliette, full of faded rugs, framed samplers, and a hideously large walnut escritoire with pigeonholes for letters no one had written in decades. It was the sort of room into which one retreated when the drawing-room was too stifling and the library too accusatory. A space made for quiet disclosures, or, as Whimsy intended, revelations of a distinctly more surgical kind. Clarissa Osbert arrived precisely on time, having changed into a deep plum tea gown that announced widowhood without pleading for pity. She moved with a deliberate economy of motion, as though every gesture had been weighed in advance and costed in emotional currency. Whimsy, who had been lounging beside the fireplace and toying with the poker in a way that suggested equal facility with coal or confession, stood to greet her. "My lady," he said, "thank you for humouring me." "I assumed," she replied, seating herself, "that you were preparing to deliver one of those masterly summings up one hears so much about. Will there be a curtain call?" "Only if you insist," said Whimsy genially, "though I find this room lacks a proper footlight." She inclined her head. "Then please, enlighten me." Parker entered behind her and remained by the door, silent and watchful. Clarissa's eyes flicked to him once and then back to Whimsy, whose expression had sobered by a fraction. "You told me," he said, "that you delayed posting Lionel's letter until after his death." That was not strictly true. She offered a tight smile. "I see Arthur has spoken." "Arthur," Whimsy said, "has confessed to reading the letter after Lionel's death, but he did not find it in the post bag. He took it from Lionel's desk." Clarissa's hands folded neatly on her lap. "Ah." Whimsy began to pace, not in the distracted, agitated fashion of those attempting to think, but rather like an actor rehearsing a movement long memorized and newly sharpened. The letter was not what Arthur expected. It warned you, rather coolly, about Sylvia. Lionel doubted her claim of pregnancy. He asked you to use your influence to prevent a scandal. Perhaps he expected your loyalty to rise to the occasion. Clarissa said nothing. But you never received the letter, Whimsy went on. Not because it never arrived, but because Arthur removed it. He feared it would ruin Sylvia, or that it would make you ruin her. A pause. And yet, said Whimsy, now turning to face her, you knew. You knew what was in that letter, because you had read it. Not a copy, not a summary, but the letter itself. Clarissa's lips twitched. And that, Lady Osbert, he continued softly, is the inconsistency I cannot ignore. How did you read a letter that was never delivered? There was a silence so thick the fire seemed to hesitate. Clarissa exhaled once, a slow, precise breath. Because I wrote it. Whimsy tilted his head. I don't mean I forged it, she said, seeing the flicker in his gaze. Lionel dictated it. I took it down, in my own hand. He was oddly formal that afternoon. He spoke as though delivering a legal opinion. He even requested I use the Osbert monogrammed stationery. The letter will carry more weight that way, he said. You penned the letter, said Whimsy. Then what? I folded it, placed it in an envelope, and told him I'd post it. But you didn't. No, she said. I slipped it into my coat and walked out of the study. I told him I'd take it to the village in the morning, but I already knew I wouldn't. Whimsy crossed to the escritoire and retrieved from it an envelope. Aged, yellowed at the edges, and bearing the unmistakable Osbert crest. He held it delicately, like a doctor presenting a diseased organ. This, he said, was in Arthur's bureau, folded inside the Tatler, between an advertisement for cufflinks and a poem about Devonshire. But he didn't write it, and Lionel never signed it. Clarissa met his gaze squarely. No. And that omission, said Whimsy, is what ruined your plan. There was a beat. You mean, said Clarissa, with a kind of bitter amusement, I should have forged his name? No, said Whimsy. You should have trusted the truth to make its own way, but you wanted control, and so you framed a narrative, just like Arthur did, just like Sylvia, all of you trying to steer a storm with paper sails. Clarissa looked suddenly very tired. He was going to leave me, you know. Not formally, not with a scandal, but he'd ceased to love me. That awful girl had him spinning like a schoolboy. He believed she was clever. Clever, mind you, as though duplicity were a kind of virtue. Isn't it? Murmured Whimsy. She gave him a long look. And you have your answer now, I suppose. You'll want to tell the police. Whimsy shook his head. No need. That startled her. Why not? Because, said Whimsy, you didn't kill Lionel. Not in the narrow prosecutable sense. The stare had been dangerous for years. You were negligent, yes. But Lionel was head of the household. He'd received the same notices from the groundskeeper. As for the recording, you didn't set it up. No, she said. Sylvia did that. But Arthur knew. He did, said Whimsy, and he tried to clean up after the fact. It will haunt him longer than a sentence would. And me? Whimsy regarded her for a moment. You'll go on. You always do. Your house is cracked now, Lady Osbert, but it still stands, and I think you'd rather endure scandal in silence than bear sympathy aloud. Clarissa did not argue. A faint knock at the door preceded the entrance of Bunter, impeccably neutral as ever. Beg pardon, my lord. The inspector has arrived. He asks whether he may have a moment. Ah, said Whimsy. The moment always comes, doesn't it? Do tell him I'll be along, shortly. Bunter bowed and departed. Clarissa stood. And Sylvia? Whimsy offered a half smile. She will remain in London. Her little theatrical ambitions will keep her occupied. For a while. But the gossip will follow. They always find their way, like mice in the wainscoting. Clarissa turned toward the window, her face half in profile. It never ends, does it? The theatre of the thing. Even after death. No, said Whimsy. That's the trick, you see. Death is not the final act. It's merely an interval. The play resumes, just with new scenery. She said nothing more. Whimsy collected the letter, slid it back into its envelope, and placed it in his coat. Shall we? He said. Clarissa nodded. She did not look back as she passed through the doorway. Parker lingered until Whimsy caught his eye. You're not charging her. Parker, said Whimsy, we are not priests, we are not gods. We are, at best, stagehands. And with that, he followed Clarissa into the corridor, his footsteps measured, echoing faintly like the ticking of an old clock one had not realized was still wound. The hallway was hushed, thick with the kind of expectant silence that follows any significant disclosure. Too late for denial, too early for relief. Whimsy descended the staircase with an idle hand, trailing along the banister, his expression unreadable, save for the glint of an inward calculation that had not quite reached its conclusion. Parker followed, clipboard in hand, though not writing, merely holding it like a shield between logic and its human consequences. Inspector Aberline awaited them in the front drawing-room, his mustache slightly askew and his boots trailing the ghost of a muddy path. He rose at their entrance with the deferential caution of one who has spent the morning interviewing emotionally volatile aristocrats. Lord Peter, he said, I've had the maid's full statement. Quite rattled, poor girl. Miss Groves, the one who came on after the funeral, said she found a scrap of burnt paper in the grate of Mr. Osbert's study. May I? He extended the item in question, what remained of a once-folded letter, now browned and curling at the edges, the ink mostly consumed. Whimsy took it gently, examining it beneath the lamp on the escritoire. Interesting, he murmured. Not for its content, but its position. You say she found it in the grate? Yes, my lord. Was the study fire lit that evening? Banked, sir. Ash and a bit of coal. Cook confirmed it hadn't been touched since the morning of Mr. Osbert's death. Whimsy looked up. Then whoever burned this did so before the accident. That narrows our window nicely. Parker cleared his throat. It couldn't have been Clarissa. She left the house that morning and didn't return until after the coroner had gone. Indeed, said Whimsy, turning the scrap between his fingers, and Arthur was with the groundskeeper until nearly 11. Aberline blinked. That leaves Miss Sylvia. Ah, said Whimsy with a kind of quiet delight, but not quite. He dropped into an armchair, crossing one leg over the other in the manner of a man preparing to correct the world's grammar. You see, he said, the matter of the recording still nags. Sylvia may have set the phonograph going, but she did so believing she was producing an alibi. She had no idea it would capture the argument between Lionel and Arthur. That conversation occurred later than she thought. She said she started the machine at 11:15, but the chimes on the recording struck 11 precisely, which means either she cannot tell the time, which I rather doubt, or she's lying about when she pressed the switch. Aberline frowned. Or someone else did. Whimsy beamed. Excellent, Inspector. We're at the crux now. He reached into his inner coat pocket and withdrew a thin envelope. This, he said, was tucked inside a copy of Punch in the upstairs music room, a rather unlikely place for correspondence, but more interesting than its hiding place is its recipient. He handed it to Aberline, who peered at the address. Miss Elaine Martin? The former Miss Martin, Whimsy said, before she married a much older man named Osbert. You may know her better now as Lady Clarissa. Aberline's eyebrows lifted. The handwriting, Whimsy continued, is Lionel's. I had Bunter compare it to the signature on several estate checks. Unmistakable. This letter, dated just 3 days before his death, makes no mention of Sylvia. It speaks instead of something rather more delicate. He paused for effect. It was, in fact, a farewell. Not to Clarissa, but to a woman named Felicity Ashcombe. Parker looked up sharply. His mistress? More than that, said Whimsy. His intended. He had drawn up annulment papers. He meant to quietly retire to a small property in Dorset with her. No drama, no scandal, just quiet erasure. Aberline let out a low whistle. Now, said Whimsy, imagine, if you will, that Clarissa discovered this. Perhaps she intercepted the papers or simply noticed the changing temperature of Lionel's affections. She dictates the letter to herself, yes, but not to Sylvia. That was her mask. The letter was not a warning. It was bait. And someone bit. Parker furrowed his brow. Arthur. No, said Whimsy. Arthur read the letter too late. Sylvia never saw it. Only one other person had access, motive, and just enough tragic desperation to act. He rose slowly, crossed to the window, and pulled back the curtain. You remember, Parker, that odd business with the broken pocket watch? Parker nodded. Clarissa said it was Lionel's, and that it stopped at the time of the fall. And yet the watch, said Whimsy, was an heirloom, a family piece. Lionel never wore it. It usually sat on his desk. Aberline stared. You're saying it was planted? I'm saying, Whimsy replied, that someone took it from his desk, smashed it at the bottom of the stairs, and set the phonograph rolling at just the right moment to give a false timestamp. But they made one fatal error. He stepped forward. They forgot the bell. Parker looked puzzled. The library bell? No, said Whimsy. The courtyard chapel bell. It rings at every quarter, but on the recording there is no quarter to chime, only the full hour. That means the phonograph was started exactly at 11. Aberline's eyes widened. So the time of death was later than believed? Exactly. And who, said Whimsy softly, was with Lionel at that time? He let the silence expand like the breath before thunder. Agnes. The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Parker blinked. The maid. She had been in service for 12 years, saw Lady Clarissa rise from junior wife to imperious matron. She had a daughter once, a child who drowned on the estate grounds. No inquiry was ever made. It was ruled an accident. Good God, said Aberline. Agnes kept to her duties. She watched as Lionel humiliated Clarissa. She watched as Clarissa hardened. She saw the affection shift from Clarissa to others, to girls like Felicity, and yes, to Sylvia. Agnes had no power to stop Lionel. But when Clarissa wrote that letter, when she left it unattended, Agnes saw her chance. She read it, believed he was going to discard her mistress for a girl with laughing eyes and a sense of novelty. And so, murmured Parker, she pushed him. She didn't mean to kill him, said Whimsy. That's the irony. She meant to wound, to punish, to delay the elopement. But he fell. Aberline was scribbling notes now, his brow a landscape of frown lines. And the recording. She set it going afterward, to obscure the time. She took the watch and broke it. She even moved the letter, possibly burning a duplicate to suggest finality. She didn't expect anyone to notice the bell, or the missing quarter chime. A knock interrupted them. It was Bunter, impeccable as always. Pardon, my lord. Miss Agnes has gone. The gardener saw her leave through the east gate. She left her apron on the hook. Whimsy's face remained unchanged. Send someone to check the chapel well. Parker looked startled. She wouldn't, he said. Would she? Whimsy only sighed. Some tragedies, he said quietly, don't end with a bang. Just a final private silence. No one spoke. The light from the window stretched across the floor like a pale limb. Outside, the birds had resumed their casual commentary, as if the world, tired of secrets, had decided to resume its indifferent march forward. And Whimsy, with hands in his pockets and eyes fixed on nothing in particular, looked once more like a man waiting for a curtain to fall. The sun had reached that unflattering height in the sky where it illuminated dust motes, blotches on the wainscot, and the lines around men's eyes without mercy. Whimsy sat in the drawing-room once more, this time less like a lounging guest and more like an academic reclining after a particularly strenuous tutorial. The silence had settled, brittle and precise, like the aftermath of a delicate operation. There was no applause, only the slow tick of the grandfather clock, counting the seconds since the truth had been laid bare. Parker, still holding the notebook he hadn't dared open in the last quarter hour, looked up at his friend with something like awe and perhaps a shade of private discomfort. So she threw herself down the chapel well? That would be my wager, said Whimsy, eyes shut, one hand raised lazily to tap against the arm of the chair, or else she is hidden in the woods with some faint hope of disappearing into the landscape like a guilty dryad. Either way, we shall not find her where we wish to. Aberline had dispatched 2 constables and the gardener down to the well. The inspector himself now hovered near the fireplace, as though proximity to warmth might substitute for moral clarity. "It still doesn't sit right with me," he said finally. 12 years in that house. All those deaths. None of them suspicious until now. Then suddenly she decides to kill him on the basis of a letter not even addressed to her. "Oh, but it was addressed to her," said Whimsy, eyes flicking open. Not in ink, but in implication. She had suffered under that household as much as any wife. She nursed their secrets, dressed their wounds, swallowed their cruelties. Clarissa treated her like furniture, Lionel like a ghost. But when she read that letter, it would not have said Felicity to her. It would have said another one. Another girl, young, smooth-handed, full of newness, being handed the affection that Agnes had never received, not even as a person. That is the moment she ceased to be a servant and became a player. Aberline looked unconvinced. "Still, no confession?" "No," said Whimsy. "Only her absence, and a trail of details left too tidily arranged. The watch, the phonograph, the letter. It is the neatness of it all that convicts her. Guilt is rarely so competent unless it knows it hasn't the strength to endure questioning." Parker, with a furrowed brow, finally opened his notebook. And what of Clarissa? Does she know? Whimsy gave a non-committal shrug. "She suspects. She's a clever woman, for all her hauteur. The kind who has always held things together, not by virtue of strength, but by a certain aristocratic inertia, like a chandelier too large to fall." He rose slowly and paced toward the window where the light now fell in narrow, slanted rectangles. Beyond the glass, the garden lay still, an afternoon stillness, unruffled by wind or decision. "What interests me more," he said, "is the timing of the letter we found this morning." Parker looked up. "The one from Felicity?" Whimsy nodded. "It arrived, you'll recall, after the arrest. That is to say, Clarissa's arrest, and yet it makes no reference to it, which suggests 2 possibilities. Either the letter was written before the news reached Felicity, or else it was never meant to reach us at all." Parker frowned. "You think someone delayed it deliberately?" "Not delayed, substituted." Whimsy retrieved the envelope from the escritoire and held it up to the light. The handwriting on the front is different from the contents. Slightly. Just enough to be credible unless one has spent too many years reading boarding school reports and forged invitations. Aberline straightened. "So it's a fake?" "Not entirely. The contents are from Felicity, but the delivery was manipulated. Someone wanted this letter to arrive just after the matter seemed concluded." "But why?" asked Parker. "To throw shade on the truth," said Whimsy. "To resurrect doubt. Felicity's letter, you'll note, speaks of Lionel's nervousness, his fear that someone was following him. It's dramatic, yes, but also ambiguous enough to imply that he had a known enemy. If we were still in the dark, it might cast suspicion on Arthur. Or even Sylvia? Or some unnamed figure? You mean someone wanted us to believe the matter unresolved? Or rather, Whimsy said, someone wanted us to doubt the neatness of its resolution, possibly to ensure Clarissa's release, possibly to stir up a second wave of suspicion that would obfuscate Agnes's role entirely. Aberline rubbed his temple. Lord, but this gets tangled. That, said Whimsy cheerfully, is the mark of an estate like this. Everyone has history with everyone else. Guilt is cross-stitched. Footsteps echoed in the hall, quick, efficient, masculine. The door opened, and a young constable stepped in, mud up to his ankles and sweat gleaming on his brow. Sir, he said, addressing Aberline, we found her. The pause that followed was absolute. Well, said Whimsy. The constable hesitated. In the chapel well. She'd left a shawl near the steps. It's deep, sir, very, but there's no body. Aberline blinked. Empty. Bottom's flooded, sir. The rope ladder's rotted out. We're getting a man down there now. Then she may yet be alive, said Parker. She may, said Whimsy, or she may have vanished into the very metaphor. In either case, her absence will hang heavier than a corpse. The constable bowed out, and the silence returned, thinner now, strained with the pressure of too many unanswered threads. I dare say, said Whimsy at last, it will take weeks to unravel the aftermath. The solicitor will be summoned, the will read. I shouldn't be surprised if Clarissa retires to the south of France and Sylvia elopes with that frightful boy from the theatre group. And Arthur? Asked Parker. Oh, Arthur, said Whimsy with a soft laugh. He'll do quite well. He has all the traits necessary for survival in a family like this. Emotional opacity, a distaste for ornament, and a sincere appreciation for port. One doesn't need brilliance to endure, merely patience and a certain stubborn cowardice. He reached for his hat and gloves. And us, said Parker, already sensing the motion of departure. We, said Whimsy, shall have tea at the inn. I believe the landlady there makes a cherry scone that could convince even the gravest detective that some evils are worth forgetting for 10 minutes. They stepped into the hall together. Whimsy paused only once, by the small table near the staircase where a cracked vase of lilies sagged with the suggestion of a ruined vigil. He plucked a single blossom, turning it absently between his fingers. I always find, he said half to himself, that lilies do best in stories where no one is quite forgiven. And then, with that faintly theatrical shrug that dismissed grief without disrespecting it, Lord Peter Whimsy pushed open the front door and stepped into the bright, mocking day. Rain had come during the night, a discreet patter over the tiled roofs and ivy-strewn gutters, and by morning the air bore the clean scent of wet stone and wood smoke. The village seemed to exhale, as though something lodged deep within its chest had finally been spoken and released. At the inn, Lord Peter Whimsy sat by the hearth, absently turning the handle of a battered toast rack, with the look of a man contemplating the moral implications of marmalade. Across from him, Parker was frowning into the dregs of his tea, the way a man frowns into a crossword whose solution has arrived one clue too late. They've confirmed the body, he said finally. Recovered this morning just before dawn. Caught against the rusted beam at the base of the well. No doubt it's Agnes. Still had the brooch Clarissa gave her years ago. No note, no dramatic farewell. Just the silence of water. Whimsy nodded once, gravely. There's a kind of elegance in that. No confession, no theatrics. Merely the cold logic of a woman who had weighed the scales and chosen oblivion over consequence. She could have run, said Parker, almost protesting. Could have disappeared, changed her name, started over. My dear Charles, said Whimsy, spreading marmalade with surgical precision, people who disappear tend to want to live. Agnes didn't. She had endured too many little deaths already. One final one seemed rather a relief. He sipped his tea and added, besides, She knew that once I'd noticed the ticking. Parker blinked. The ticking? Of the phonograph, said Whimsy. When I visited the drawing room, there was a record still playing. Rather an odd one, Debussy of all things, but it had run to the center, and the needle was still ticking in its groove. Now, if Lionel had truly been listening to it before his death, it should have finished before midnight, when the servants claimed to find him. Parker frowned. So it was played after the murder? Precisely. Set up to suggest he'd been alive longer than he had been. And then there was the question of the letter's arrival. It did not merely turn up late. It was delivered with perfect dramatic timing. A detail only Agnes, with her quiet control over the household's petty logistics, could have orchestrated. So the entire affair, the arrest, the red herrings, the suicide, was a performance, said Whimsy. A carefully arranged tragedy, with Agnes at once director and fatal heroine. He rose and moved to the window, gazing out as if hoping the village green might deliver one last footnote. There's something dreadfully Shakespearean about it, really. You recall Ophelia and her flowers. Agnes had none. Just a folded apron, a clean stare, and the satisfaction of silence. Parker stood as well, brushing crumbs from his trousers. And Clarissa? Ah, Whimsy mused. Clarissa has returned to London, apparently taking refuge at the house in Sloane Square with a view to writing her memoirs. Among the dead, a matriarch remembers. I imagine it will be part social commentary, part therapeutic confession, and wholly misleading. And Arthur? Reinstalling the clocks, said Whimsy with a thin smile. And doing so, I suspect, with more than mechanical fervor. He's the type who believes correct time can cure any emotional chaos. I wish him joy. Parker lingered, half turning toward the fire. Do you ever tire of it, Peter? Knowing the end before the others have even begun guessing? Whimsy did not answer at once. Instead, he traced the edge of the window-sill, then looked up at the grayish clouds that hung like ancient muslin over the rooftops. Tire of it? He said at last. No, Charles, but I sometimes wish the ending were less frequently written in blood. He turned then, fully, the usual glint in his eye, muted but intact. Come, there's a train at noon, and I've had quite enough of brooding villagers and cryptic correspondence. I feel a craving for London's dirty comfort, booksellers, tobacconists, and something irredeemably French for supper. They left the inn just as the sun broke briefly through the clouds, catching on the wet stones and setting the hedgerows sparkling like an afterthought of diamonds. Behind them, the innkeeper swept out the hearth. Somewhere down the lane, a child was singing a half-remembered hymn. And as they boarded the waiting car, Lord Peter glanced back at the old road that wound past the chapel, past the well, past the place where secrets had drowned and names had dissolved. Time, he said softly, is the one butler no household may dismiss. And, with that, the door closed behind him.